Okay, so I'm doing the intro. We have also Paul Pangaro here, who's currently the president of the American Society for Cybernetics. I'm Claudia Westermann, vice president of the American Society for Cybernetics. I'm very happy to welcome you to the second day of the Circular Currents event, organized by the Art, Media, and Cybernetics Working Group. And it came up yesterday in these talks, the interest in the use of computational processes for the creation of art has a long tradition in the ASC. Pioneers of media art and electronic music, Gordon Pask and Herbert Brun, for example, have been involved with the ASC, and some of their students are here today. The Art, Media, and Cybernetics Working Group is led by Benjamin Bacon and Vivian Xu, and this event has been strongly supported by Yannis Bardakos, Matthäus van Stralen, and Merve Sahin. And I hand over to Benjamin for this.
Thank you, Claudia. Before I give a little intro to the AMC Working Group, I just want to thank again Ken, Charissa, and Joost, who gave fantastic presentations yesterday, and you really got a lot of excitement happening within the participants here in the I guess hybrid presentations and panels. And yeah, I just really want to thank all of them for all that they've done over the last day. And really looking forward to the panel discussion today. So with that said, so the AMC working group, we basically are, we're setting out to really explore the evolving intersections of cybernetics, art, and science, building on the mid-20th century movements where artists and cyberneticians pioneered conceptual and collaborative approaches. Through panel discussions, online events, and a growing index of artists, theorists, and key concepts, we examine how cybernetic thinking continues to shape art and media in today's technological and ecological landscape. We aim to advance cybernetics in artistic practices, foster interdisciplinary dialogue, and connect students, practitioners, and researchers in rethinking art as a reflexive system. We are happy you have joined us in shaping new conversations at the intersection of systems thinking and creative practice. And we have much thanks to Claudia and Paul and the ESC for supporting us in this endeavor. Again, about this event, for the year 2025, the working group will host a series of events that explore the topic of cybernetic ontology to better understand the trajectory of cybernetics as an epistemology, a practice, and a method, and also to identify potential development trajectories for the future. We examine this through the lens of tangible cybernetic manifestations, specifically performative artifacts and system-based art and design practices. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Vivian, who's going to kind of MC the rest of the panel for the evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Claudia and Ben. So I think we want to leave the space for today mostly for participant engagement with our speakers. And so, but to warm everyone up, I wanted to pose 3 questions to all the panelists to get started. So we'll do them one by one, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience. So feel free to raise your hand and speak up, or to post your questions in the chat so we might address them. So question number 1. So everybody yesterday broadly referenced different aspects of cybernetics that really influence their work and their thinking. I wanted everyone to think about their body of work in general, and maybe for us summarize and highlight some key cybernetic concepts and approaches that resonated in your work, in your practice, in your research. And how do you see the evolution of some of these concepts, past, present, and future? All right.
Does anybody want to start, or should I jump in?
Go, Ken, go.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'll just jump right in. So the question is, what are some of the key cybernetic concepts and approaches that resonate with my work? It's quite extensive. For me, I think even just the term autopoiesis, issues of feedback, emergent behaviors, and system environment coupling for me are core cybernetic ideas that deeply resonate with my practice. I think I'm especially drawn to this idea of second order cybernetics, where the observer is acknowledged as part of the system. And this reflexivity for me is crucial in interactive art. In works like autopoiesis that I showed yesterday, the augmented fish reality, the fish-driven robots, but also other works I didn't get to show yesterday given limits of time, works like the paparazzi robots, which are robots that basically force you to smile in order to take your picture. They basically follow you around and take your picture only if you smile. The robotic and the biological systems not only respond, in this case, to the viewer and or the environment, but also they evolve through those interactions. And I'm further exploring this idea of coevolution and trans-species communication in particular, because I'm really interested in the voice, in quotes, of other, and really drawing on the concepts pioneered by folks like Maturana and Varela and Gordon Pask with his work in human-computer interactions, really to highlight the relational dynamics between living systems, machines, and viewers.
I
Thank
can
you,
build on
Ken.
that if you want me to, or do we
Please.
want to? Is that because I think something else? Because I think this was a question yesterday. How are the three of us? What do we hold in common? So yeah, I think central to my work on cybernetics has been the human-machine interface, because actually, so my turn towards cybernetics overtly and to biology at the same time was really with a book I wrote called Automotive Prosthetic. So that book was about the car-human interface in conceptual art, to add that in. But yeah, so I'm very much interested. And so what I'm going to do in keeping with this, I want to share an article. I already shared it with Joost. This is something I read yesterday. It's about, I mentioned biotechnics yesterday, which is something Raoul Francais was interested in, the Austro-Hungarian soil botanist and microbiologist. Non-human technology. So that's something that's in that article. If anybody wants to read it, it's a great article. And it also gets into something else we could talk about, the politics of some of this thinking and its connection to the fascism, not American fascism today, but Nazi German fascism in 80 and 90 years ago. So I know that the human-machine interface is central to my work. I mean, I think another thing that I talked about yesterday is feedback. Like for me, sincerely, circular causality is so empowering because it's so central to systems thinking, as opposed to linear causality. I mean, because in the United States, it seems like part of our tendency or our violent culture is built on the individual and the idea of the self, which is the notion that you alone are responsible for whatever crime you've committed, rather than understanding the problem as part of a more environmentally situated, systems-oriented problem that is social, culture, and maybe all of our responsibility at some level. So that's something else. Something I'm interested in for all of us to talk about, because I've had students over the years concerned with the role of where do we find footing for political agency within cybernetics. So that's something to talk about. And another thing I'm concerned with, and I really love about this group of people, the younger generations working on cybernetics, is the great diversity of faces. The gender and diversity expanding in the field, or in the kind of focus on cybernetics, away from what was predominantly one way, one group of people looking at it at the beginning in the after World War II. So those are just a few things to think about and talk about together as a group.
And add to that
Wonderful.
some other things. Just to go back really to more like historical views of cybernetic, like I think in my evolution, like I really started as a kind of composer of music and of films. And then very slowly it sort of dawned on me that a lot of these kind of structures I was trying to compose were actually emerging if I built the right tools. So that I was started to think more in terms of sort of interactive structures which have sort of inherent properties and have certain behaviors. And in the film I talked about yesterday, that was, I think, very prevalent. I built this tool and I really was sort of engaging with these electronic models. And it was really for me that like notions like tipping points and attractors and basins, they become something really, well, I'm going to use the word again, visceral, like they become extremely concrete and not just abstractions, but it's really things you can sort of turn and navigate around. So that's really, I think, a very basic thing, which I find is very cybernetic. And then there's two other ideas I would like to sort of, put into this pool of things we already have to talk about. Like one thing which really attracts me a lot in the sort of certain schools of cybernetic thinking in the late 50s, early 60s is, I think, yesterday we mentioned Gordon Pask and Stafford Beer. There's something like a promise of a kind of organicist technology. So something like a technology which can be really different, because it's based on different philosophical premises. And I find this a promise which I'm very curious about. I think it's something which could lead to something which is also really necessary at this moment. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm very curious about it because I can also not really imagine what this would be. So I remember like Gordon Pask talking about having one complex system being coupled to another and then sort of regulating themselves. I find it a very interesting idea also because it turns sort of the engineer or the designer into more like a kind of steward of systems. So I think that's really interesting. And I think also in this kind of situation where you are coupled with other devices or systems, what I find very interesting is also that like goals can be destabilized or adapted or co-created. So that's one idea, like this dream of an organicist technology. And another idea I've been thinking about recently very much is also going back to the same period, to Gordon Pask, and his idea of the natural historian. And what I got from that idea is the idea that lots of things which we can tend to sort of put in objects like intelligence or self-organization are perhaps much more fundamentally relational properties. So you cannot, I mean, I don't know what really happened in the early 60s with this research on self-organization, but one theory I read is that it's like because of views like Pask, like that self-organization became something you could not put in a box and sell. And I think that perhaps intelligence, like if you think now about AI, intelligence is perhaps something similar. It's much more a property of a relation rather than something which you can actually program and put in a box and sort of, make it unsituated. Okay, so that's two more ideas I wanted to pull into the pool of things to talk about.
Thank you, Joost. So moving on to the second question to expand a little beyond that. What does the role of cybernetic artifacts play in your work or in your thinking? And I want to expand a little bit beyond that because our world today has expanded beyond mere objects, right? So I want to include also larger systems, in a sense, tangible manifestations of some of these ideas. How does that really relate in your work? Thank
you. Well, I guess I'll just jump in again if it's okay. For me, this idea of cybernetic artifacts in my installations is really that I don't see them as passive sculptures by any means. I really see them as living interfaces. They sense, they respond, they evolve, they co-create meaning, both with the human and, in the case of some of the works, with the non-human participants. For example, in the work, The Entera Consciousness, the microbial community in the gut becomes a kind of biocomputational actor. In essence, it really does become a kind of a partner in the art. And for me, these artifacts are really not representations, but they're operational, they're performative, and they're intersubjective. They allow me to materialize questions around sentience, machine learning, ethics, and multi-species kinships in tangible and importantly for me, embodied ways. You know, I think that one of the things we really haven't got to discuss too much here is the relationship of cybernetics to both embodied forms of art and non-embodied forms of art. But I just want to throw that out there.
I'm going to jump in again, and we can maybe just loop through in I don't know, in an order, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But well, cybernetic artifacts for me are well, I teach them in my classes because I come from, you know, art history, so it's a very artifact centric field. Even though I'm not always really the most artifact centric, they always are. You know, there's a will to abuse the person who does it, who wants to talk more about people and cultures around it through art, in art history rather than objects. But I do like curating. I mean, so I like the history of curating cybernetics. So Jascha Reikart's very important, famous cybernetic serendipity, and then the shows of Kepesh. There have been many, many important exhibitions that are about cybernetic works of art and cybernetic thinking. And then I'm just going to toot the horn of Ken and me and Amy Young's. I'm curating a show in a year at UT Dallas called Organic Worlds, and it's about symbiogenesis in art. And so that's going to be about cybernetics. There'll be artificial intelligence and all kinds of technology involved in the exhibition alongside of living organisms. But something to think about that is perhaps even fundamentally cybernetic in some sense, and we can talk about how that might be, is a post-artifactual world. Sustainable art practices that do not engage not making artifacts. What does that look like? And what are our students to do? And how do we guide them? And how do we understand a post-artifactual art world? And I'll stop there.
If we're looping, I will jump in again. Yeah, it's interesting because the post-artifactual, I think that's a super interesting notion. But I think if I think about my own practice, I'm really a builder of artifacts. So that's I've been recently, and I'm really very directly inspired by these historical machines. So also the types of devices. It's basically, I think also since I've started working with electronics that it's really became very concrete. So like the devices of Ashby and Basque, as far as possible in the sort of very fragmentary documentation I've really studied. And yeah, the devices I've built, I've been really inspired by these historical examples. So in that sense, they are like these cybernetic artifacts are really important at this moment in my practice. So yesterday I talked about this works I did with analog computing. And at the moment, I'm working on projects which are very directly inspired by these thread structures. Gordon Pask, this chemical computer, as he called it later. Also because I find it so interesting to build a device, or somehow almost perhaps a contradiction in terms, to build a device that is able to capture what's the word? Contingencies, or to incorporate things like aspects of the material, like what I talked yesterday about, like that can incorporate affordances of materials which are not planned at the beginning. So I see it as a kind of desire to automate hacking. I mean, that's a very crude way to put it, perhaps. And that's an idea those are ideas which really I find super interesting.
But Joost, you know, your work is also physically and materially about recycling and rescuing old analog devices. So that's another thing. That's another path to making artifacts in some sense.
Yeah, and it's also something like also in relation to something which Ken said. I think I'm also starting to think more and more of the sort of the whole technical milieu or the sort of the whole technical environment which we build. Like, you know, artifacts, of course, is also a bit of a it's a very classical view of technology from a time where perhaps steam engines, you know, had like a kind of metal case around them, and now all technologies are networked. Like all devices have to be connected to, you know, electricity, all these things. So everything is intrinsically networked. So I find it very interesting also to think about like this constant traffic between like human culture and the sort of shell of devices we build around ourselves, and how to sort of reduce the weight of this shell on the planet. And one way is, you know, like reusing. I mean, just things like, you know, like movements like permacomputing, where they really start to think about like recycling and making, you know, small local computing centers based on already existing equipment. I mean, I find these are very interesting developments, sort of thinking about these existing shell of devices.
Yeah, I really, I'm excited by the trajectory of this conversation and this idea of recycling. And it's interesting to me because so much of our, you know, so much of our art world is really focused on this idea of something that's collectible, something that a museum could own, something that a rich person would buy to decorate their home or something. And I like this idea of reuse. And I would say that in a way for me, that's an important question, because it begs the question about whether or not we should have artworks that should have lasting lifetimes, or in fact, if an artwork could be something that just happens as a blip. In fact, maybe the artwork is something we consume, and the process of the artwork is just the poop that's left at the other end. It makes me think of Wim Delvoye's brilliant work, Cloaca, perhaps one of my favorite works on the planet. But, you know, this sort of divorcing ourselves from this idea of having to always make something that's collectible or even something that's beautiful. Could we focus instead on process? Could we focus on an aesthetics of process, or an aesthetics of beauty that comes out of process and degradation, for example? So just to follow up on some things Charissa and Joost had spoken about in the reuse and recycling.
So I think actually there's a momentum here. So before we move on to the prepared third question, I want to pull out two questions relating to what the current discussion. Number one is from Paul Pangaro. So he says, on Ken's comment, co-creating meaning, if the artifact, the non-human, creates meaning, where does that meaning arise? Put another way, to what extent does the artifact participate in experiencing meaning, if that is acceptable framing? And Paul, you can elaborate if you wish.
No, if that makes sense on its own, I'm happy to have it addressed. Thank you.
Well, I'm very happy to address that question. And for me, it actually gets back a little bit to a question that Regine asked yesterday about, about working with living systems. And in a way, I think what you're asking, if I understand your question correctly, is what is the perspective of other, and where might others find meaning in the works themselves? I don't actually think, let's say, in my Terra consciousness, that the bacteria that was in the work was really fully aware of the fact that there was a massage chair attached at the other end. But I was aware that I could make the bacteria very comfortable. And the design itself was designed to make the bacteria comfortable. So it existed in its own world, not unlike the mitochondria in our own cells existing in our own bodies, giving us adenosine triphosphate. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking, and yet I know that the energy in my brain and my eyes and my body are all part of their existence. And I would say the same would be true, let's say, for the augmented fish reality, which I showed yesterday, the robotic fish tanks. For me, the only question I really needed to ask was, where and how could the two systems come together? I felt like I could create a very comfortable home for the fish because I'd researched enough about what the fish really wanted, what were their needs. And I think those, for me, are the kinds of questions we as artists working with living systems and bioart always need to ask, which is, what is the living environment for the, in quotes, other, and how can we support that environment as best as we possibly can?
Another thing building on that is the question of which is kind of what Paul's asking, is where does the meaning sit and for whom? Because there's meaning in cellular communication within our bodies and outside of our bodies and between our bodies, certainly between our bodies, that's going on, that's meaning making, that has nothing to do with any of us and our kind of idea of consciousness. Its meaning is everywhere, being made by all kinds of creatures, to each other and not to each other. That has nothing to do with us in some sense, and our ideas of meaning and what's important to us, right? And so just thought I'd throw that out there.
But it has to do with, then, if not us, then it has to do with. That was a question.
Oh, well, right. Well, my point is that, I mean, are you talking about meaning in art? I mean, for humans then?
Ken's comment was about co-creation, and I'm curious
Right.
about
Yeah.
what the side of the other is and how much it participates. I think you need an observer to have the meaning arising. So I'm not sure about what happens when I'm not there.
Well, there's meaning that's made without creatures that through creatures and between creatures that don't have eyes. So there is meaning already. Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So maybe we need what is the meaning? I mean, I don't want to split hairs, but observing, I mean, there's more to meaning than observation, because creatures perceive the world through all kinds of sensual parts of their being that are not eyes or optical.
Yeah, no, I mean observer in the broadest cybernetic sense of observer participant without commitment to a particular sense. So we agree on that. Thank you.
If I can add on that, if you think about co-creating meaning, I was sort of thinking about it like how, because I don't work with bacteria or living organisms, but I work with, with what I described as this technical shell, this kind of sediment of technology. So then you're not co-creating really at the same time. And one notion which I find really helpful to think about these kind of collaborations of very different partners is this idea of mutual capture, which is by Isabel Stengers. So it's also, because if you say co-creating meaning, it sort of suggests that these meanings are also related, or that the two observers, or that there's a process between two observers and that they have a similar meaning. But if you say mutual capture, it can be that it's for one party, it's a completely different meaning than for another. So it's like, like if you think about butterflies and flowers, like there's one interaction, but this means completely different things for the butterfly, and it means completely different things for the flower. So I find this idea of mutual capture very, very interesting to think about, like things with non-human participants or participants which are distributed in time. Yeah, that's a notion I would like to propose.
Great. I've got a great quote here, if I could just read it really quick, from Heinz von Forster. Objectivity is the delusion that observations could be made without an observer.
Thank you, Ken. So I have a follow-up question, actually, mainly inspired by some of the things that Charissa alluded to of immaterial and process-based or maybe ephemeral art. I myself have been looking back at land art practices and thinking more about environmental art today, but land art pioneers from the 60s and 70s. And there seems to be sort of two approaches from the collection of artists. One approach focusing on sort of the monumental, adding almost permanent structures in the landscape, and then there is the other that is more intimate and embodied and meant to be ephemeral. And I think it's very interesting how some of these practices in the 60s now I think could also provide insight for today's world. And I wonder if, to all three guests, if you see this sort of moving away from objects and material artifacts, having more process-based practices, but even ephemeral, not meant to be permanent kind of practices do you see that happening in today's world? Are there anything that you've seen that's radical and exciting in this domain?
My students, all the students in the doctoral students in our creative PhD, they are all moving towards performance. They're just always, they're thinking fundamentally about performance in a way to try to get away from the centrality of a certain idea of the artifact.
Yeah, I'm really excited by the group, the Yes Men, and how they have completely engaged the political system to make performative works of art that basically work to undermine some of the very dark systems that seem to exist in our own culture. So, but it does, your comment also, Vivian, makes me think of the works of Agnes Dennis, for example, and some of the more environmental approaches that we see emerging today. And you know, it's difficult not to look back at the works, for example, of my wife, Amy Young's, and some of her works building worm bins and thinking about the act of eating, but also the act of digestion and methane. And she's building these tremendous worm reprocessing systems that are designed basically to reprocess our waste and stop methane from entering into our environment. So that would be an example for me of a contemporary artist working in those realms.
Yes, I'm aware of Amy's work.
Oh, good.
Fantastic, yeah.
No, I just wanted to echo what Charissa said. Is also what I see with my students and ex-students is that they very often work in collectives. They very often do more like performance or performative installation type work. So I also think that this idea of art being the same as the art world, I think that's for a lot of young people, that's completely not the case. Like they're really interested in very different things, which are also political and yeah, much more process-based.
So moving on to the last prepared question, then we will open it up more widely to the audience. So what role do you think cybernetics and art could play in facing and addressing today's challenges, whether it's political, economic, or environmental? And I know we've already started coming into some of these discussions through previous discussions, so I'll open it up to the speakers.
I guess I'll just jump in. So I think that's a really great question and a really important question, and I thank you for asking it. For me, cybernetics, especially when infused with art, really for me gives us a language for complexity and for understanding the complexity. And I see it as a way to navigate and perhaps even choreograph and thinking about choreographing this kind of entanglement that I think that some of the non-linear crises that we are currently facing. For me, things like political systems really suffer from very rigid hierarchies. I see economic models, for example, that very clearly are ignoring ecological feedback. I think we're all understanding we're in a major space of an administrative nightmare right now, especially with ignoring all of our ecological nightmares. Things like environmental degradation stemming from disconnection, for example, for me are very much a part of the World Wide Web, not experiencing those things very directly. So in my view, you know, I really see cybernetic art could be thought of as activist art. For me, it reveals hidden systems. It critiques this kind of techno-solutionism. And this is why I'm really fond of what Joost is doing with recycling works. And I think it offers alternative ontologies. I think it encourages empathy with machines, but I think it also encourages empathy with animals and insects and bacteria and the agency of others. And I think this creates a kind of aestheticized speculation, if you will. And I think it presents a possible future. And I think it can act as a kind of soft technology for transformation and a way to really cultivate things like systemic awareness and design, I'm hoping, regenerative futures. I just want to illustrate that years ago, I heard a General Electric's researcher talking about the production of a new circuit board. And he said, the only problem is it degrades in 3 months. And everybody was like, oh, that's such a shame. And I thought, are you kidding me? Do you realize what you have? This is brilliant. A circuit board that will degrade in 3 months, and we don't have to send them off to India or some other reprocessing space, because it would become regenerative. And we know that biological systems are regenerative. So anyway, sorry for my rant.
I'm wondering if getting into the ontology of cybernetics that you guys are focused on in your workshop, if somehow, because cybernetics seems to be technologically, if it's connected to the internet and radio waves and in a little bit of a deeper history, connected to a kind of immediacy, how we think about duration, and if somehow we could think about it in the longer, in the deeper time that I alluded to at the very beginning of my talk yesterday, if we could somehow have it be part of a longer political cycles, because the political cycles that we have, 4 years in the United States, or 2 terms of 4 years, for example, and I think most other places, they're just way too short for the responsibility and focus it takes to really ameliorate the problems we've created. So I'm just thinking about what is the nature of time and duration with respect to cybernetics, because I think so. I agree with everything Ken said. Is that there's so much to be said for what cybernetic technologies can do, improving things, and then the meaning making of those technological networks, and time, what in duration and temporality, begging for could we use cybernetic thinking or ontologies to help us broaden our sense of the political cycle? Or maybe none of this will happen within a political cycle. Maybe the true change will help happen in another kind of cycle.
I think I have very little to add. Like Ken said it very well, I think. Yeah, like for me, I think if I think about the role cybernetic art could play, I'm also really thinking about like speculative devices and like showing sort of different ways to be attentive to like non-human agencies in all kinds of different ways. So that's, I think, things we've already discussed and I don't have to repeat. But there's one thing I also really want to put in is, like, I think the last 3 years I've spent really quite a lot of time reading like the sort of the old cybernetic literature, like until sort of the mid-60s. And one thing which really struck me is the sort of incredible sort of explosion. It's a bit of like a kind of Cambrian explosion. Like you have a few sort of core ideas which meet, like the ideas that minds and computation devices and organizations could share some similarities. And then from there you have like this kind of explosion of different ideas. And I also realize now, like when we talk about cybernetics, we talk about like a very small selection of all the different ideas which were called cybernetics at some point in this history. So I want to also talk about the diversity of ideas, and I think that's really something which I really find super impressive from this cybernetic explosion, I would like to call it. And that's also something I see now, like if I think about, like when we talk about like collaborating with non-human agencies, and if I see this sort of explosion of ideas about people thinking about mushrooms as a model, or plants, ecologies as a model for, you know, things humans can do. I mean, I think I also really see this kind of explosion of really a lot of different approaches, like different ways to think how the structures we have could be different and could be less cancerous. I mean, that's really the word which for me always comes back when we think about the current technological networks we live in, is that it's a kind of cancer if you compare it to a biological system. Like it's unsustainable, it will just grow and it will eat everything and we will die. So we have to have all these other models to help us think about how we can change our technology.
Wonderful. So we have a question in the chat from Victor. What about rural versus city population gap? And Victor, please jump in if you want to elaborate upon that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question,
Oh.
Victor.
So I could read there's subtext here. It says not a question. I would go with to be honest, but that came just after the political topic was mentioned and has not another one to come instead. Yet there's a lot of cybernetics as in social, perhaps like cities, acceleration, educational delays for rurals, etc. Perhaps gaps. I suppose yes. Yeah. So I think maybe the question is addressing more sort of discrepancies globally, locally between different regions, from more of a pulling it back maybe to the human perspective and human spectrum. And so, what about some of these discrepancies? How do you think some of the ideas that have been presented could could I guess maybe manifest or be implemented within the context of these discrepancies, understanding that not everything is universally the same. Victor, am I reinterpreting your question correctly? Sorry.
Victor? I don't hear Victor, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question completely, but I do want to mention that as an artist concerned with environment, I do think often about the difference between cities and rural areas. And I think a lot about, what we're consuming, the nature of subdivisions, let's say outside of cities that require cars, roads, infrastructure, et cetera, the cost to the planet, the cost of utilizing, fossil fuels to get to those homes. For me, cities seem the most survivable forms of spaces where humans probably need to live, and to leave the rest of the natural living environment alone as much as we possibly can. Just really quickly, I'm completely stressed out by Trump's recent notion that he's going to start mining the ocean for for materials, for precious metals and for precious substances for building new so-called green cars. So yeah, to me, cities are the place to live, along the lines of a book called The Green Skyscraper by Ken Yang, a very interesting book about humans living in cities, the need to live in cities, basically to allow natural living cities outside of human participation and destruction, basically.
Can I jump in here? Because we all have to bear in mind what a city is and how it's defined. I mean, yes, I know I am much happier when I don't have to drive and I'm not attached to my car. But in this country of the United States and North America, most cities are automotive, and so you also have rings. You have the old central business district, the original city, then the new way, the oldest ring of suburbs. Then you go further and further out and into finally where you hit the hinterlands. And so, but in fact, Los Angeles, which we often think of as a nightmare because it's so central, it's so developed around the car, it's maybe one of the densest cities in the country. Maybe its density has high density. So density is probably a thing we are after. And also just the infrastructure is also built around the automobile, which is deleterious to our everything, to the human health, to the health of pretty much so much life around us. How do we design automobiles that are not so deleterious to life, biological life? So I just wanted to try to jump in and say something a little clarifying about how we define rural and urban, because it's a bit more complex than just, a binary.
I find it interesting that if you look back to like sort of visions from the 60s about alternative technologies, they're very often they're very small scale. They're they're thinking of for instance, farms associated with cybernetic machinery, like a computer or something. and it will all be networked. So that's a kind of machine in the garden type fantasy, which is, I think, for a lot of people still a kind of utopian vision. And I completely agree with Ken that in fact the sustainable, the image of sustainability it seems to be much more like this kind of dense centers where you have much more variety, much more also biodiversity in a way. Like it depends, I think, also very much on the country in which you live. But in like where I live in Belgium or in the Netherlands, like there's much more biodiversity inside the cities than in the rural areas, because it's much more toxic because they use all these chemicals in the agriculture. So yeah, you have a lot of these very interesting reversals where in fact the thing which was for a very long time the nightmare is like the very dense metropolis is in fact a much more survivable place.
It's much more ecologically sound, in fact. I believe people living close together.
Yeah, definitely.
Perhaps we should disagree about something. It would be good for the discussion.
It looks like Mark Sullivan disagreed.
Ah, that's great.
Yeah, I think it's too simple a template.
Is it?
I think there's rural communities that, particularly if you look into indigenous communities, that have a lot to offer us in terms of how to live in areas that are not dense and still take care of the environment and take care of people. And I think maybe I do agree that the kind of density that's been mentioned and that some of the aspects of the city can also be highly desirable. I just think that a more complex network would include various kinds of social organization and relationships with both local and broader environments. So it's only a partial disagreement, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, you look at the indigenous peoples in the rainforests of Brazil, for example, and you find peoples that are living in complete synchrony with their environments. There's enough food for hunting, and the people are very happy. So I completely agree with your comment, Mark. But of course, we know we're dealing with a population explosion. And I guess for me, the bigger question is, how do we deal with the close to 9 billion people on the planet? Where do they live? How do they survive? You know, the kind of environmental crisis right now is the death of our soils, the need to use things like whatever fertilizers, fossil fuel based fertilizers to feed the numbers of people that are here. So in the meantime, we're killing our oceans just so that we could feed ourselves. So yeah, and for me, in small populations, villages, perhaps disconnected by cars or high-speed rail, you're looking at a really idealistic place of survival and happiness and freedom.
I also think that could be the role of design and architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some really interesting examples, for instance, in Brazil and a couple of other places of taking what originally was designed for ski lifts as a way to move people through dense urban areas without cars or even buses.
Love it. Yeah, in Colombia, they used to move from mountain to mountain via these aerial tramways, and that was a big surprise to me. Leaving the environment in the valleys alone and just moving material with these aerial tramways was really a great way in Colombia to get things from place to place.
Yes, I'd like to also say there's a lot of comment activity in the chat, but also if you want to, since we are open to discussion right now, if you want to just turn on your camera and speak about some of those comments so the discussion flows, that's also really good.
Can I speak up?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Roger Molina. I've been starting a practice where I just keep lists of things I noticed. And it's a little bit surprising. Right now, there's a red closed parasol outside my window. It has no meaning, but I noticed it. And once I made a list of several things I noticed, I started analyzing it. And then I realized the cybernetic loops I was creating by noticing things, feedback loops, first, second, third order, and so on. And I'm just really interesting, and I've been listening to you writing down things I noticed that people had said. And they're not rational or logical. One of you had a book on your bookcase that said machines think or something. I forget what it was. Why the hell did my mind capture that thing that had nothing to do with what the person was saying? So I just want to put on the thinking table how noticing and learning how to notice differently might be also a cybernetic method that's worth thinking about. Thank you.
Completely agree. Yeah.
No, but it's frightening how we get into routine ways of noticing, taking notes, etc. And I think, you're all expressing anxieties at the moment. And I kind of like Carissa's thing that we have mechanisms that are too short term to deal with long-term problems. Now, we don't want dictatorships or Napoleon again. The United Nations didn't work, but we do need long-term mechanisms that create feedback loops. So thank you, Charissa.
So I think somebody raised their hand. Sorry, I don't see the hand raising anymore. If you would like to speak up, please do so.
Yes, I can jump in about Roger's foregrounding of noticing, relating, of course, to attention modulation. I think it's basic in ethnography, although there are no rules or even advice on how to do ethnography, because it's going to be such an individualistic thing. However, I think it's basic that we don't look for things, we notice everything, which means we miss a lot, but over the long duration of a typical ethnography, which might extend for years or a lifetime, you notice a lot. And in noticing, the first time you notice something is what is most provocative, because you noticed that particular species of flower for the first time, and you note it, but you missed it for days or weeks or years. So it's very humbling to be aware of noticing. It's not just acquisition, it's reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was gonna, to follow up even further, this kind of like moment where we're all addicted to our telephones and to our screens. This is such a distracting time and a distracting space. And noticing is probably one of the most important things we could do. And I'll never forget taking a river rafting trip down the San Juan River and being told I had to leave my phone. It was perhaps the most relaxing vacation I ever had. And I think I noticed more about the natural living systems and the river that I'd ever really noticed. And it was because I wasn't so distracted by all of the devices all the time, feeding me information, pumping me with advertising and so on. So for me, noticing also is about an ecology of space that one creates for themselves in order to have the space to relax and really look and see and notice.
Okay. So I'd like to do a last call of any questions or comments. And if not, I will pass this on to Benjamin. Okay, Ben.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. This has been very stimulating and fantastic. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of announcements, and we have a number of things. Seems like we just had a large, is that a question or not? I'm not sure. If it is a question, we do want to go back to it in the chat. Okay, so I think, so we're going to wrap up, I think. And so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Charissa. Thank you, Joost, for the wonderful discussion and presentations yesterday, discussions today. It's really been fantastic. And we're going to wrap up with a couple of different things. So one, for joining the AMC, so we are really interested in getting feedback and talking to anyone who's interested in being part of the working group. And we're going to have a meeting coming up soon that's going to be open to everyone. That's going to be, I believe, Saturday, May 24th. We will send an email about this and get that out there. And we have a number of initiatives that we're really interested in pursuing. One is to continue these discussions and these speaker series, but also, you know, we have thoughts about doing a zine. We have thoughts about doing possibly a podcast, and there's a couple of different other ways that we're thinking about how we can really promote this intersection of art, media, and cybernetics. And we can talk more about that then. Also, you know, if you just wanted to send us some feedback, that'd be great too. I think somebody might be, maybe Vivian or somebody will be posting our the different information in the chat. But also, we just had a special issue of the Journal of the Constructivist Foundations, which highlighted selected papers from the 60th anniversary meeting of the ASC, Living Cybernetics and Playing Language. This just happened last summer. So the special issue is out. And I think some of the details are going to be posted here. And I'm really proud to say that the AMC came up with both the cover, and there's multiple members of both the AMC and the ASC who have published articles in that journal. And then also, I think that might be it. I think the rest of the stuff is being linked and sent into the chat. So with that, thank you, everyone. And I don't know, Vivian, if you had anything else to add, or Claudia, or Paul.
Thank you. This was very inspiring, and lots of lots to think about in the future. So thank you very much for initiating this.
Thank
and
you.
carrying it through.
Thank you. Could I just end this by reading one important quote from Sarah Imari Walker, this philosopher who I'm so obsessed with right now, and I think it's relevant. She says, "Technology, like biology, does not exist in the absence of evolution. Technology is not artificially replacing life. It is life."